Hello and welcome to the Swayam MOOCs. This is the third module of the course on economics of gender and development. And in this lecture, we will give you an introduction to gender economics. In the previous session, we basically explored why gender matters in economic analysis, why we need to pay attention to how gender shapes labor markets, production, care work, and policy outcomes. Today, we will go slightly deeper. We move from the motivation to the framework, from why to how. And in this lecture, I will try to give you the conceptual foundations you will need for the rest of the course. We will unpack the meaning of gender, understand how norms shape resources and opportunities. We will examine the concept of time poverty, which is very central to the understanding of gender economics. And finally, we will see how gender plays out at the micro, meso, and macro levels of the economy. So you can think of this lecture as building your analytical toolkit. Now, let us begin with the basics. When we talk about gender, what do we actually mean? Now, gender relations shape economic outcomes at multiple levels. We have been brought to understand this. But in everyday conversation, gender is often confused with sex. But in economics, and particularly in gender economics, we make a very sharp distinction. Sex is biological, it includes chromosomes, reproductive organs, there are hormonal differences. But gender, on the other hand, is social. It is produced, it is taught, it is reinforced and reproduced through norms, institutions, and everyday interactions. Now, gender determines what role we perform, what opportunities we are allowed, how we use our time, how power operates within households and markets. Gender influences what is considered appropriate behavior, what jobs are suitable, and who is responsible for which type of work. And these expectations actually vary across societies, across time, and across classes and castes. Once you start seeing gender as socially constructed, something clicks in your mind. People do not behave in the economy as isolated, rational, utility maximizing individuals. They behave as gendered individuals, embedded in norms and expectations and shape their choices. So now let us understand what these norms actually do. Gender norms are powerful because they guide behavior without being written down anywhere. And there are a lot of unwritten rules that govern everyday life. And they influence what tasks men and women perform outside and inside the home. They influence occupational choices, mobility, the use of public spaces, political participation, and even aspirations. So, gender is not only a micro level household issue, it actually produces economy wide effects. Now, let us try to understand gender matters at the micro, meso, and the macro level. Now, at the micro level, when we talk about gender matters and how it intersects with the economy, we are essentially looking at the distribution of paid and unpaid work within households that affects labor supply, savings, fertility, and human development. And in the last class, you have already been introduced to the term social reproduction, which is basically the time, the resources, and the care that is needed to maintain and reproduce the labor force, which is unequally distributed and largely performed by women. At the meso level, we have institutions, which basically refers to labor markets, firms, different credit systems, and social norms that mediate how gender inequalities translate into sectoral outcomes. And gender segregation of jobs shapes employment patterns and wage structures. Now, what happens at the macro level? At the macro level, we consider how gender inequalities influence savings, investment, growth, fiscal policy outcomes, and structural transformation. So, macroeconomic models that ignore unpaid care assume unlimited supplies of women's labor, which is a major flaw revealed after the 1980s structural adjustment program. Now, when we look at the macro level, the level of national accounts, fiscal policy, growth investment, and structural transformation, these all have very important policy implications. Now, traditionally, macroeconomics treated labor as an input that simply appears in the market. It assumed households would absorb shocks, that unpaid care work would stretch infinitely, and that women would compensate for public service costs. But feminist macroeconomists, there are many feminist economists who go by the name of Diane Elson. There is Barbara Evers, and more recently Izaskun Zuazu. They have challenged these assumptions, and they show that gender inequality affects growth, investment, savings, consumption, and fiscal outcomes. So, gender is not a side issue, but it is a macroeconomic variable. And if labor force participation is low, growth is restricted. If women have less access to assets, investment suffers. If care burdens rise, productivity suffers. If austerity cuts reduce public services, the cost is absorbed through women's unpaid work, leading to time poverty. But before I move on to time poverty, let us try to understand this question of why models that ignore unpaid care assume unlimited supplies of women's labor. Now, what is the underlying assumption in standard neoclassical model? The traditional macroeconomic models, whether they are classical, neoclassical, or even some Keynesian frameworks, they treat labor as an elastic input, meaning that can expand or contract as and when needed to absorb policy shocks. They implicitly assume that if public services are cut, households will compensate. Households will take care of those services. If social protection shrinks, then domestic labor will fill the gap. If healthcare or education budgets shrink, then families, more particularly women, will provide these services unpaid. And this assumption is rarely stated explicitly in these models, but it underpins the logic of many macroeconomic policy reforms. Now, one of the major changes that we started seeing with respect to macroeconomic models actually began in the 1990s, when the structural adjustment program was introduced in many countries in the early and late 1980s. In India, it was introduced in the early 1990s, and the structural adjustment program, by the nature of it, required cuts in public spending. There was retrenchment of public services. A lot of user fees were imposed in health and education. There was privatization and reduction of public subsidies. So governments reduced expenditure, assuming that households would adjust. But then who adjusted? Mostly it was women who adjusted. How did they adjust? They adjusted by increased unpaid care and time poverty. Now, let us spend some time on increased unpaid care. When the state started withdrawing from expenditure on social sector services, so that means that the public services were cut, women did more home based nursing, education, water collection, food provisioning, and then their time spent on unpaid work increased dramatically. And this increased unpaid care is related to the concept of time poverty, as I will elaborate in the next slides. Now, because unpaid care rose, women had less time for paid work, their productivity declined as far as the market transactions are concerned, and that also led to reduced earnings. And this basically leads to a broader point that gender economics is not simply an extension of micro or labor economics, it is a rethinking of the economy itself. Because after the structural adjustment program of the 1980s and 1990s, when many countries cut down on public expenditures, assuming that households will compensate, they actually assume that women's labor is unlimited, or the supply of women's labor is unlimited. But this assumption slowly started turning out to be false. Women's unpaid labor was overburdened, leading to care deficits and reduced human development outcomes and weaker long term growth. So, therefore, in some cases, there was increased maternal mortality rates, there were increased infant mortality rates, enrollment rates in schools were going down or were not taking up like it was expected. So, when such things started happening, this became a major turning point in the understanding of how the economy needs to be shaped, or how the intersection of gender needs to be understood with the economy. It showed that macroeconomic models that ignore unpaid care and time use can produce flawed outcomes. So, by acknowledging the care economy, we acknowledge that markets do not function in isolation. They depend on households, communities, and public services. They depend on gendered labor, and more importantly, they depend on what is called social reproduction. And feminist economists have developed new macro models that integrate care, time use, and gendered labor supply. These models reveal some kind of a loop where how public expenditure affects women's time, how women's time affects women's labor supply, how labor supply affects growth, and how growth affects care needs. So, this is a richer and a more realistic way of thinking about economics. Now, so therefore, the paid economy cannot function without the unpaid care economy. So, social reproduction, just to summarize to you what social reproduction entails and how, as feminist economists or as scholars working in the area of gender and economy, we want to integrate this concept in the functioning of the economy. Social reproduction basically involves time, labor, and resources needed to produce, maintain, and replenish the labor force. If one has to ask the question, what is social reproduction? The definitional aspect of social reproduction is this: the macroeconomic aggregates, that such as output, employment, and savings, they are shaped by gender divisions of unpaid and paid labor, and therefore ignoring unpaid care leads to an incorrect assumption in macro policy, because we are presuming women will absorb cuts in public services by increasing unpaid labor. So, mainstream macro models, neoclassical or Keynesian, treat labor as input that appears in the market, but feminist macroeconomics shows us that labor is produced through social reproduction, and gender inequalities in care directly affect growth, investment, fertility, and labor supply. So, when we are externalizing social reproduction, it will lead to failure of macroeconomic models. We need to integrate social reproduction or the care economy, the unpaid care economy within the larger macroeconomic models. By assuming that households would absorb shocks, the models treat women's time as infinitely elastic. They are costless, they're always available, not competing with market activity or not affecting productivity and labor supply. But the idea of social reproduction and the integration of unpaid care economy shows us that women's labor is not infinite. Their time is finite and already heavily committed to unpaid responsibilities. So, the structural adjustment program initiated in many developing countries revealed that unpaid care is part of the economic system. Ignoring it leads to incorrect macro predictions. Women's time constraints affect macro outcomes, and austerity creates hidden costs that do not show up in GDP but reduce human development. So, thus, feminist macroeconomists argue that macroeconomic policy cannot be designed without accounting for unpaid care, time use, and gender division of labor. Many of you would recall from your earlier readings in economics that it is during the 1990s that there was a lot of emphasis on human development. Human development index as a concept also started being overemphasized, and not just GDP. So there was a clash of ideas with regard to whether GDP is a more representative indicator or we need to complement GDP with other indicators of development. And gender gets into this discussion very intensely, because when we look at the issues of human development, we started looking at outcomes by gender or outcomes by region, outcomes by different countries, outcomes by gender intersecting with other identities as well. So this is the genesis, and this is the arena and the domain within which gender and economy needs to be considered. Now, let me briefly sort of introduce you to some of the major strands of feminist economics. Although within the larger discussion of gender and economy, feminist economics is a branch in itself, and there are many contrasting, conflicting, and cooperative ideas between understanding of gender and economy and feminist macroeconomics. However, some of the major models that we study with respect to feminist macroeconomics are highlighted here. One is growth and gender inequality models, where we are basically examining the two-way links between growth and gender inequality. Here we show how women's labor force participation, wages, and bargaining power can influence investment, savings, and structural changes, which are the basic macroeconomic variables. We also look at the macro modeling of the care economy, which is basically incorporating unpaid care into macro models. And here, examples can include Kaleskian and Keynesian models that integrate caring spirits and social reproduction into care provisioning. We also talk about social infrastructure and intra household allocation, wherein we talk about public spending that models how public spending, social infrastructure, and intra household bargaining that can influence productivity and growth. We also show how social policies can shape gender equality and macroeconomic outcomes. So, when we're looking at some of these major strands of feminist macroeconomics, we are basically trying to interrogate the idea that gender is a macroeconomic variable. It is not merely a social category. And this is one of the major contribution of feminist economists to the study of gender and economy. Now, let me take you to this very important concept of what is called time poverty. Now, in the context of data evidence based policy in India and many other developing countries, there's a lot of contribution of what we call as time use surveys. These are very powerful tools for measuring unpaid work, and they reveal massive gender gaps in time allocation. And time use data allows economists to model labor supply more accurately and to quantify the value of unpaid work. And of course, there have been many contributions by what is called gender budgeting, by analyzing how public expenditure through a gender lens can be carried out. Basically, the policy instruments such as gender budgeting will ask who benefits, who pays. Does a given policy reduce or increase women's care burdens? Does it improve women's access to services and opportunities, and so on? So, feminist economists have transformed how we want to think about well being. But let me now take a moment to understand how South Asian feminist economists have shaped this field. And one of the feminist scholars who comes, who needs to be mentioned here is what is called Naila Kabir, who is called Naila Kabir. And Naila Kabir's work on employment, on empowerment, highlights that agency is not just about making choices; it is about having the capacity and freedom to act. And some of these research has given to the field of gender and economy the concept of time poverty. So, what is time poverty? When individuals lack sufficient discretionary time after meeting their essential survival and care responsibilities, that is referred to as time poverty. So, time poverty is not just merely lack of leisure, but it is a structural constraint which is shaped by these various identities intersecting with each other, such as gender, class, caste, age, and social norms. And because of the intersections of all these identities, time becomes a structural constraint. And when that structural constraint leads to a lack of discretionary time at the disposal of people, that refers to time poverty. So, what are feminists arguing here? They are arguing that just like income and other assets, time is a fundamental resource, and it matters how time is distributed within households, and who does what kind of work, and who is continuously reproducing labor because of the use of the finite amount of time, which is a fundamental resource. And feminists argue that time is unequally distributed within households because of a gender division of labor. We also refer it to as sexual division of labor. Because of this gender division of labor, then time becomes a fundamental constraint. So then, why time poverty is central to understanding women's economic lives? As I just mentioned, that there are a lot of South Asian scholars who have contributed to this argument, and across South Asia, empirical studies have shown us that women perform 4 to 10 times more unpaid work than men, and this is coming from various International Labour Organization studies, various kinds of time use surveys, individual carried out by national level databases, or individual surveys carried out across different countries. And here, scholars such as Naila Kabir argue that this compulsory labor shapes women's entire opportunity structure because the social reproduction is unavoidable. And this is what she's referring to as compulsory labor. And this compulsory labor shapes what are the different kinds of opportunities available for women's labor. because this compulsory labor reduces mobility, it limits their participation in paid work, it constrains education and skill formation, it also restricts their political and social engagement, and finally, it narrows the bargaining power within households. So, therefore, scholars in this field argue that women actually face multiple burdens. The term triple burden was coined in this context, where it was referred to as the triple burden, referring to reproductive work, productive work, and community or kinship obligations. So, reproductive work constituting care economy or caring, cooking, cleaning, etc. Productive work meaning paid or unpaid family labor, and then there are various community and kinship obligations which are primarily met by women. So, this triple burden basically creates a chronic lack of time, which directly translates into an economic disadvantage. So, how does Kabir conceptualize time poverty? She conceptualizes time poverty as a constraint on agency. So, here Kabir states that women's agency requires resources, agency, and achievements, and time is embedded within resources. And when one doesn't have control over one's time, that agency cannot be exercised. So, therefore, she says in various places that women's choices are deeply constrained by their obligations of care. And it is this time poverty that limits a woman's ability to seek better jobs, negotiate wages, attend various kinds of training programs or education, participate in public life, invest in rest and health, pursue aspirations, and so on. So, thus, policies that increase women's time burden, example, water scarcity, lack of childcare, poor transport, these directly reduce their economic environment. So, what we have studied so far in this lecture is that we understand that when we are looking at gender is not just a social category, it has to be looked at as a macroeconomic variable. And when we are looking at it as a macroeconomic variable, which has macroeconomic implications, we have to understand that gender intersects with the economy, its different units at the micro, meso, and the macro level. At the micro level, it intersects with the household economy, where we are talking about distribution of time between men and women within the households and what kind of work they are doing. At the meso level, there is the role of different kinds of institutions. And at the macro level, because of the interaction of exchanges taking place at the household level and the meso level, we see it has implications for larger macroeconomic aggregates such as savings rate, investment, fiscal capacities, and so on and so forth. And then we moved on to this very important conceptualization of time poverty, which is central to understanding of gender and economy, which where there's a lot of work by South Asian feminist economists, and we have understood time poverty as some kind of a lack of discretionary power in the hands of women. And that lack of time or time poverty becomes then a constraint on agency of women. And when there is a constraint on agency of women, it directly impacts their macroeconomic aggregates in terms of employment, in terms of wage rates, in terms of their access to education, participation in public life, and so on. Now, in this conceptualization, there is also a discussion about how men's, women's, and children's time poverty differ. We have understood women's time poverty. For example, in poorer households, if we can picture poorer households where, because of lack of access to paid care services in the market, care obligations rise, dealing with illnesses, disability, aging, and so on. There is water, fuel, and food insecurity. Therefore, there is increased time for collection of all of these resources. Informal work, which leads to irregular hours, continued unpaid care. There can be migration of men, as a result of which there are women who are left behind with dual burdens or multiple burdens. There's also and because of absence of public services. Now, along with this, if there is an absence of public service, you can think of Anganwadi centers, let us say. When you have poorer households who cannot have access to an Anganwadi center, then you can substitute it with more domestic labor. So women then essentially experience less rest, less leisure, less sleep, less time for paid work, and greater physical and emotional destitution. Now, this leads to time poverty traps, and today's time poverty then reduces tomorrow's opportunity. So, this concept is referred to as a time poverty trap. And there are many feminist scholars who have contributed to this understanding, and we have very rich literature in this area currently. Now, while we are discussing time poverty trap in the context of women's time poverty, we also need to now differentiate it with men's time poverty. How is it looking very different? Men's time poverty is structured differently because, as far as are concerned, there are long paid work hours in, let us say, manual labor, let's say construction workers, transport, mining, etc. Because as far as men are concerned, also there's a lot of occupational segregation in certain select occupations, such as, let us say, the construction sector. There are long commutes due to urban spatial inequalities. There are migration based work with long stretches away from the household. They may be looked at as the major breadwinner within the household, so therefore it limits their leisure and care time. There are masculine norms which discourage rest, self care, or flexible hours, and men's time poverty is primarily market driven, it is not care driven. And therefore, men rarely face simultaneous multitasking responsibilities, second shift after paid work, or unpaid emotional labor. So, even when the work hours are long, the nature of their time poverty differs. Now, it is not to argue here whose time poverty is more or less. That argument can be had. But we have to understand that there is a structural difference in the way women and men experience time poverty. Now, it is in this context, let us also look at how children suffer time poverty or how children are exposed to time poverty. Now, here, when we look at children, especially girls carry significant care burdens because they are minding younger siblings, they are fetching water and firewood, household chores, they are supporting home based work such as, let us say, weaving, tending to livestock, food processing, and so on. So, Naila Kabir and others have pointed from their Bangladesh studies that girls' school attendance falls sharply when they are attending to care activities. Boys' time is more protected for education, and girls internalize these care norms very early, which shapes their lifelong gendered labor patterns. And the girls face generational time poverty, as a result of which it leads to lower education, early entry into domestic roles, limited skills, reduced future bargaining power, and intergenerational transmission of what is called gender inequality. So, this is essentially a structural problem, and it is not an individual problem. You could say this problem is also created by the market, but it also begins within the household. So, therefore, when we are looking at gender and economy, time becomes a very important foundational resource that needs to be analyzed. And time as a measure of poverty needs to be center staged because we cannot just look at income poverty. There has been a GDP estimates or macroeconomic estimates surrounding income. The macroeconomic aggregate of income gives a lot of emphasis on income poverty, but gender and economics or feminist economics try to bring in the concept of time poverty because that has major implications on future incomes. So, traditional poverty measures focus on consumption or income. Feminist economists argue that that is insufficient because a woman may not be income poor, but she may be time poor due to unpaid care burdens. Households may appear non poor, but girls may have no discretionary time, indicating deprivation. Men's market hours and women's domestic hours cannot be compared without recognizing the unequal value assigned to each other. So, poverty must be understood as a multidimensional phenomenon which includes time poverty, care deprivation, psychological burden, mobility constraints, opportunity deprivation. It is in this context that feminist scholars such as Dia Nelson brings in the call for the 3 R's, or what is called recognize, reduce, and redistribute, which is a framework that is built on this insight. So, in this third module, what we tried to do is to look at why study gender economics and an introduction to gender economics, where it is important to center stage the idea of unpaid care economies, social reproduction, time poverty. And let me end by discussing that why gender time poverty matters for macroeconomics. Now, macroeconomic models, as we know, ignores time poverty, assuming that there is infinite elasticity of women's labor supply. There is costless substitution that can take place between market and non-market labor, and household labor is a shock absorber. But this leads to flawed fiscal prescriptions, and we have seen this from the experiences of the structural adjustment programs. There are different kinds of austerity measures that were carried out. The user fees for health and education increase, the cost to public infrastructure, and the reliance on unpaid care to compensate for the lack of public investment. So, time poverty actually reduces availability of women's labor for paid work, resulting in labor market which can impact labor market prescription, productivity, aggregate savings and investment, long term growth, fertility decisions, human capital formation, and so on. So now, not just that gender is a macroeconomic variable, but time is also a macroeconomic variable. It is not just a household issue that gender economics or feminist economics center stages in macroeconomic models. For these two lectures in module 2 and 3, I have used a number of references. I have not referred to the references within the slides, but those who are interested may like to read more details from Beena Agarwal, from Deanne Elson, Nancy Folbray. There are Indian scholars who have contributed immensely, such as Jayati Ghosh or Indira Hirve, other Bangladeshi scholars, Naila Kabir. There are other Latin American scholars, such as Seguino and others, who have also contributed immensely to this field. And some of these literature can be considered by the beginners to gender economics to build a conceptual foundation of why we are approaching the issue of care economy, and what is the how critical is it to center stage care economy when we are considering macroeconomic models. So I thank you for joining me in this session. I'll see you in the next class.